Hey, welcome once again to Bleeding Edge Interviews. I am your host, Super Dave. Thank you for joining me as once again we dig into the minds of those making all that amazing progressive rock and metal. Well, actually, this time's going to be a little bit different. We're not going to be talking to one of the artists. We're actually going to be talking to an author. Only the second time that I've done this. We're going to be talking to Brian J. Heaton, who's written a book called Roads to Madness, a touring history of Queensrÿche 1981 to 1997. And this is a compendium of all the information you could possibly want about Queensrÿche's touring history during the classic lineup of the band. We're talking photos, individual reminiscences, history of the shows, history of the tours, everything that went on stage, in the audience sometimes, behind the scenes, all the stuff you could possibly imagine wanting to know about the touring history of Queensrÿche during this period, and then some. It's an amazing feat that he has put this book together, and you're going to get to hear all about what drove him to do this, how this passion project came into being, how he gathered all the materials and information. It's a really cool story, I got to say. So without further delay, let's get into my conversation with Brian J. Heaton, author of Roads to Madness, a touring history of Queensrÿche, 1981 to 1997. Well, thank you very much for joining me. It's great to get a chance to talk to you about this. It has been a very long time in coming. For that, I need to apologize that I got caught up in things. And the turnaround on this was much longer than anticipated, but I do appreciate you getting together with me.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So what we're talking about, of course, for those tuning in later on, we're talking about your new book, Roads to Madness. And of course, this is a book chronicling the tours of Queen, all their tours with the original lineup.
That's right. Yeah, it's 16 years worth of tour dates in history.
That's amazing to me. I have to ask, because I know there's a lot of different things people will do. Oftentimes, you get like a group biography or a group history where they focus on how the band came together and all that kind of stuff and the personal interactions. I'm not as familiar with a tour history as you've done here. And what leads somebody to say, you know what, I want to pull all of that history together? Because to me, that seems like almost the bigger endeavor. Because a band gets together once, they make each album once, and then maybe they break up once or whatever, but they make an album and then they tour 20, 30 times in support of that album. This, to me, seems in many ways like the bigger endeavor. What was your inspiration for this?
It's a great question. It actually has multiple answers, so I'll try to be brief with it. I've like a lot of music lovers, I fell in love with seeing Queensrÿche live the moment I saw them in 1995. I saw them on the Promised Land tour. And it started off this collector thing for me where I started collecting all their live shows and bootlegs that they had for years. And I started a website back then called Breaking the Silence, which was chronicling kind of all their tour dates and the tidbits of history that I had. And I continued that website under a bunch of different names since 1996 up until 2016. And it was the Breakdown Room and it was anybodylistening.net. And then finally I shuttered the site and was working on the biography that I was a part of, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, but on the band. And then I ended up wanting to revamp the website and realized that my web design skills were really way far out of date for what I wanted the presentation to look like. And after I got done with the Queensrÿche biography, I really wanted to do something on my own. And it just seemed to me that that was the perfect fit, where I could take my knowledge of the band's live history that I had been collecting for 25, 30 years and put it together in some sort of book that was reminiscent of ones that I've seen done by Rush and Kiss, where they detailed the dates and the different songs that were played and had great pictures and different things like that. And that's kind of what started it. I've always been a big time collector of the band's live material and huge fans. So it was a natural fit for me.
Perfect. It sounds like you had done a lot of the early footwork needed for the book and the creation of the website in that sense, because you had a lot of this stuff in place. And in many ways, I guess it's more of a transfer from one medium to another.
Yeah, kind of. It's fair to assume that too, but there was actually a lot more work than it sounds.
Yeah.
One of the surprising things for me was on those websites that I had for years, that I had some errors, not a lot, but I had some errors that I reconfirmed all that information that I collected over the years, tracking down bootlegs I didn't have, listening to bootlegs, making sure I had all the set lists and everything that was correct. And there were parts of the Rage for Order tour that I had a little incorrect on the website. Those have been fixed. So it was actually a few years' work kind of putting this together and re-verifying everything, which was a lot of fun, to be honest, because I ended up listening to 300 some odd Queensrÿche shows again. And to be honest, it just kind of reaffirmed what an amazing live band that original group was.
300, that's amazing in and of itself. And to think back when you started a lot of this, I mean, that was like, it was the internet, but it was not the internet we have now. And so many of those recordings obviously would have existed before the internet as we know it now. And which means that a lot of them were probably on cassette. Some of them may have been transferred to CD. Like, we weren't talking digital downloads you had to hunt down. You had to hunt down physical media for a lot of that. Yes? What was that like, trying to get all that stuff pulled in?
Well, luckily for me, when I started collecting a lot of those bootlegs and a lot of those different things, first it was on cassettes and then later CD. And, as I got older and I had a little bit more disposable income, I would buy the ones I saw on vinyl and the silver press CDs and do all that. But as we've led into, the last few years, for me, I was lucky I had those shows and I had transferred them all to digital sources. So they're all in waveform. So it was easy for me to just pull it up on the laptop, throw on a pair of headphones and just start transcribing and listening and going back. It's a great hobby. And it's one where I think nowadays it's so easy to just jump on YouTube and listen to a show. It was a lot to collect that stuff back then. And, it's with technology is actually, it was funny. You mentioned like listening to these shows and doing this. One of the things that I made sure I did not do was rely on setlist.fm and other online sources for set lists and for other information that I didn't have. I've noticed that setlist.fm and things like that are really useful now. They're really useful in 2024 to see what a band played over the last maybe 10 years. You can get a pretty good idea. But for people who just jump on who are casual fans and want to see what a band played in 1986, it's awful because there wasn't any quality control. And that was a big push for the book, was for Roads to Madness, was Queensrÿche's not getting any younger. The original lineup has been gone for almost 27 years now. Yeah. So it's one of those things where I kind of felt like I have all this information. I want to get this out to other fans that are just as passionate about that era of the band as I am. And so that was the big thing. Let's make this as accurate as humanly possible.
Yeah. And that's, like I said, that's a lot of fact checking. That's a lot of rechecking. And it's amazing that you had the energy and the drive for that. Because I think for me, my possibly ADHD-addled brain has never been formally diagnosed. I could see myself struggling with the focus to do that. In particular, like when I look at things like all that stage banter recorded from all those shows, and I look at that and I think, I can picture myself listening to those and getting lost in what I'm listening to, and next thing realizing, oh shit, I forgot to write that down. I got to do that now. And so to me, the necessary focus to do it probably exceeds my grasp.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. I know the stage banter was an interesting story. Initially, the book was not going to have any of that in there because I could have gotten it out a lot sooner had it not for all the transcribing and such. But what I was going to try to do was a lot of these tour history books have a lot of tickets sold and venue capacity information and different things of that nature. And I wanted to include that in Roads to Madness for Queensrÿche. But I came upon a problem as I started. I started with Here in the Now Frontier and worked my way back with that information. There wasn't enough verifiable data out there as we got into the 80s, especially the Rage for Order tour and the Warning, to really make it to mirror it, to make everything consistent in the book. So I scrapped that idea, and then listening back to the bootlegs, I'm like, you know what? I've never seen one of these tour history books with stage banter from the musicians on stage. Maybe I can go ahead. Maybe this would be unique. Let me throw this in there. So I devoted myself to making sure that I did that for every show that I had, and then others that I didn't, that I just, I found on YouTube and I listened to them. There weren't many of those, maybe like half a dozen, but for 300 some odd shows or whatever, I tried to get that banter as accurate as possible, including foreign language. Tate's French and Spanish is terrible.
That had to be fascinating. I guess then you got basically hire contractors to translate for you, right?
Luckily, especially for the Japanese stuff, I have a friend of mine who's a professor of Japanese history, and I gave it to him to do. I said, do this for me.
It's good to have the right connections.
Exactly.
And I must have missed the parts because I knew I would never get done for myself. As slow as I tend to read and as much distractions as I had, if I read every single line of the banter, I missed the parts where Tate was attempting Japanese and Spanish. That would have been interesting.
Yeah, it was. I just tried to stuff as much detail as I could in there, Dave. To be honest, it was. It was really a labor of love. I've been a fan of the original lineup of Queensrÿche from the moment I heard Walk in the Shadows back in 1987. And, for me, I'm really a collector. I've got that bug for different things. And, I just kind of wanted to, now that we're in 2024 and we're all older and it's been so many years, I kind of just wanted to put it in a form that folks had at their fingertips, that, folks that are sitting back and having a beer on a Saturday night and putting up a show on YouTube or something. Hey, I was at that gig, and you pull open the book and you find all the details about the show that you were at that, it was 25 years ago. The memory gets a little hazy. Well, I wanted to make sure that I could put together something for the band that had that level of detail in it.
Yeah, that's amazing too. In the course of all that transcription, were there parts that you came across? I know you don't want to spoil too much for those who want to read the book, but were there any parts you came across that kind of left you really going, holy crap, he said that?
Being the collector for so long, I wasn't really surprised at any of Tate's stage banter because I remember hearing it back in the day, and I listened to a lot of those live shows still. So there's some familiarity with that. However, what I found was that one of the unique aspects is every show there's usually a breaks in the show where the frontman talks. I mean, that's true today. What he or she says is different, could be different, it could be the same. I always thought Tate stuff, going back on memory, was exactly the same for each show. I remember collectors, my friends and other collectors, we would kind of laugh that Tate was really scripted. But what I found when you go back and you listen to each of these shows, all of them are minutely different. Like, he wasn't as robotic as I thought he was, which was kind of cool. There were instances of, there was a show in Sacramento, California on the Rage for Order tour where some poor man, I think it was Sacramento in the Rage tour. It might have been the Warning tour, where the poor man got his leg crushed by the barrier, which broke down. And so you have Tate telling the crowd to step back and that kind of thing. So there were a lot of those type things where when I was collecting and listening to these things in the past, I was more paying attention to the music, not necessarily what Tate was saying to the crowd. Right. So there's lots of cool little finds in there where you'll hear Tate and even Chris DeGarmo here and there talk to the crowd and say a few things. That's really interesting. Some hometown show stuff and other things like that.
Yeah, they're admittedly, and I think that probably is common with a lot of performers, artists who are not necessarily adept at, ad-libbing and making up as they go along, that they fall into a certain rhythm of, here are the things I normally say at this point and for this song and yada yada. And that's certainly on display there. Not everybody can be, say, a Devin Townsend, who, if you've ever seen him perform,
Yeah.
he is absolutely an ad-libber. And they watched him, technical difficulty in a show, and he basically monologued for about 3 minutes at like a Robin Williams level of joking and goofing. And I'm like, holy smokes. And I find that's probably pretty rare, so, hopefully they are at least a little bit creative. I think the thing that struck me most with Tate was and I don't know if this one stood out for you or not. I believe it was the the New Year's Eve show, 1988.
Mm-hmm.
And he starts talking about one person changing the world with a bullet. He repeats, just one bullet. And I'm going, boy, I'd really like to hear the intonations of that reading, but I'm going, Jeff, what are you going on about? Because kind of freaking me out, dude.
Yeah, that was, I remember that. That was, I believe it was during Chemical Youth, if I remember correctly. He had this whole rant in that live, and it was, they had played that for a while, and he had this whole rant. I know he said it just takes one, and I remember hearing that. Yeah. But he said a whole bunch of interesting things. A lot of the interesting stuff I felt, which it was a little hard for me to transcribe. I mean, I did it all, but it was long. It was during the Promised Land tour, because he had these long, like 2-3 minutes at a clip. At least it felt that way. Mm-hmm. Of stuff he was saying night in and night out as he talked about the Promised Land and the story, and as things went along, and he was acting as he went along. So that was a bit of a challenge, but very interesting, the things he would say. And it gave more color to it. The thing I like about Roads to Madness, this book, is it's interactive. And that's a big thing that I wanted to do with it. And I have a co-creator on the book. His name is Brian Nairn. And Brian is kind of the visual guy to my writing and way with words. He's very visually into things, and is a big time collector as well. And he mentioned making it as interactive as possible. So a lot of the imagery and the way that you use the book, and because you can use it as a reference guide, you can use it and read it cover to cover. You can flip through it for the pictures. All of that kind of color and interactivity are things that really were pushed by Brian Nairn. And I got to give him a lot of thanks and appreciation for what he did. He was a big part of kind of pulling the visual aspects of this book together in the interactivity that I think people who check it out will see.
Yeah, it works very well for those who are visually oriented in that sense, like me, and I like the organization of it. And just how it's sort of section by section for the tour. You got the history of it, you've got the list of shows, you've got the stage banter, and you've got all these pictures to go with it. And of course, they're interspersed throughout, but then there's also at the end of each section, you've got like the posters and the tickets and the T-shirts and all those things, which, for me, a lot of that, especially the 80s, is a trip down memory road, so to speak, down memory lane, kind of recalling how all that stuff looked back then, even though I was kind of at the age where parents weren't ready to let me go to something like that until I was a bit older, but still a lot of it quite brings back memories. Now, I'm curious about one thing, and I saw these interspersed throughout as well, where you've got quotes from attendees. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, how did you obtain those? Were those part of the bootlegs? Was there somebody recorded saying something in there, or where did they come from?
That's a great question, too. I'm glad you asked, because a lot of it is from my fellow collectors who went to these shows, and I solicited them. And I said, hey, you went to this show. Give me something from the show, like what you remember, something that stood out. My wife is in there a couple times for shows, the classic shows that she went to from them, and some good friends. And I would say, there's got to be 20 friends of mine that gave me little quips and tidbits from shows. Other people, when I have my website, other people would write in and tell me what they thought about a show, like when they were there. They would give me, he goes, yeah, I was at the, I'm trying to use a show off the top of my head. I was at the show in Madison Square. Well, it wasn't Madison Square Garden because I didn't play there. But anyway, you know what I'm trying to get at. They were at this or that show, and here's what I remember. And what I did was I took all those and I put them in as small little tidbits at the end of each listing of each gig listing. And then to kind of push that out further, I kind of used a little bit of crowdsourcing as well. I would go to YouTube and see the videos for the live shows that people would talk about. And the venues that I went to, because I've gone to see Queensrÿche at least, where am I at? I'm at least 40 times, I think, at this point. The original band I've seen just a handful of times, I think 3 or 4. But certain venues, particularly in New York, where I grew up, in Northern California, where I now live, some people would say certain things. You can tell on YouTube where somebody's actually been at a show and where somebody is just reacting. You have to, go through that stuff really carefully because, again, I want to be as accurate as possible. I didn't want people just saying, hey, I was at that show and just not saying anything. The people who said I was at Lemoore in Brooklyn and it was over here where there was this lift and a rise where you used to stand and look, and this is where I was, and I saw Jeff doing this. Well, I've been to Lemoore's in Brooklyn when it was still around. I knew exactly what that person was talking about. So when I saw things like that, I employed crowdsourcing a bit and pulled some of that commentary. But to keep people's privacy, I would basically just use, if they had their name, I would just use a first name and a last initial just to make sure that everything was on the up and up. But mostly, to be honest, I really just took things from friends and people who I've known and who wrote in over the years to my website. I mean, when you have a website since the mid-90s, you tend to build up a lot of people who chime in with that stuff. And again, this book is all about the fans. It's the fan perspective of what we see or what we saw from the band. And so that was really important to me, was to involve all of us who really enjoyed the band and being a part of this book that catalogs every show that they did.
Yeah, that's impressive. And especially people that can remember that far back and can remember the levels of detail. I'm a little jealous because that's also something not within my capabilities, is I can think back to shows I was at, and in most cases it's hard for me to remember too much specific about the show. It is more overall impressions and things like that. And sometimes I wish I could pull out that level of detail about those experiences, because it's like, geez, I feel like it's like I was there, but I still feel like I missed something now because I can't recall.
I just, it's funny going on this, and I'll get off this in a second, but one of my first experience seeing Queensrÿche live was the Promised Land tour in 1995. I had been a fan since '87, but my parents wouldn't let me go see a show until I was an adult. So I had to wait till I was 18, and that was in the mid-90s. And so they finally said go, and I went. And I remember being I was this gigantic Queensrÿche fan, and Queensrÿche had played Silent Lucidity, and I was with my buddy Rob, and I had never been to a concert before. They were my first concert, was Queensrÿche. And so they finished with Silent Lucidity. And so I elbowed my buddy Rob, and I said, come on, let's go. He goes, you sure? I said, yeah, it's Silent Lucidity. They're done. I didn't know. So we walked out the tunnel in Jones Beach, getting to the concourse in New York. And we walked on the concourse, and all of a sudden they came back out on stage. I had no idea what an encore was. It was the funniest thing ever. So we ran back to our seats, and the people who were behind us, basically, he's like, we were wondering where you guys were going. You sang every single song. We figured you'd stay for the encore. Had no idea. So little things like that, for me at least, I can remember certain instances and different bits of detail and different things like that.
Yeah. And that's the funny part. If I do remember much of anything, a lot of times it is less what the band did and more what I did. Things like that. Wandering our way up from back of the floor, like level up of the spectrum, all the way to somehow there were magically 3 seats, like they were waiting there for the 3 of us in the back of the front section. wasn't super close, felt miles away, but still it was much better than we had. And so we just parked ourselves there. I remember that. Do I remember exactly what Rush did that night? Or I think it was Blue Oyster Cult opening for them? Oh, hells no. I remember they were there, and I remember they were great, both of them. That's what I remember.
Right.
So that's the funny part, overall impression. But oh yes, let's keep in mind what I did, because that's important. And I don't know about you, but the hardest part, I think, in many ways, of looking at some of those old pictures is seeing the old ticket stubs, and seeing the prices. That kills me. Wow, what happened to us?
Really, because I'll be honest with you, next year will be 30 years of concert going for me, and I will be over 300 shows that I've seen. And when we were doing those ticket stubs for Queensrÿche and just ticket stubs of shows I've done in the past, now, like this Saturday, I'm going to see Sammy Hagar do his Van Halen thing. And the cost of the tickets in comparison to what it cost to go see Rush in Hartford, Connecticut on the Vapor Trails tour, it was like, well, that was a huge show. Their first show back as a band, Rush. And it was pennies in comparison to what shows are now. It's just kind of funny.
Yeah, it is an amazing thing, somewhat disheartening thing, and it is an absolute indictment of Ticketmaster.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, incidentally, I guess is not technically just a figment of speech at this or fact, of speech at this point, because I guess they were indicted by the DOJ, weren't they? Ha ha. I think, especially when I look back at the early days, especially 84, 85, how busy these guys were. They were absolutely grinding it out and just touring, whether it was opening or headlining or whatever, nonstop. But I think the other thing that struck out, especially as, metal, whether it be thrash or pop metal, whatever you want to call it, mid-'80s, it seemed to me, and I wonder what your impressions were, that promoters had a hard time figuring out what the hell to do with Queensrÿche.
In certain aspects, they did, yeah. It was also on the Rage for Order tour where things got weird for the band and you hinted about where to put them with other bands. Queensrÿche started that tour, if I remember correctly, opening for AC/DC and then opening for Ozzy. And then they wanted to headline. They actually had a headline tour of Europe planned, and then they changed management. Some things happened, some things went off the rails, and so they canceled their European tour, but they didn't want to miss out on going to Europe. So they ended up just taking a gig. They were offered Bon Jovi, opening for Bon Jovi. So that really is not a great pairing, but they jumped off with Bon Jovi so that they would get to Europe on the Rage 4 cycle. That was important to them. And so it was definitely kind of a weird pairing. And sometimes they've had, they toured with Rat. I know they did that too. And that's kind of a weird mix as well. Yeah. But I think they've actually been lucky, though, especially on the Warning tour, opening for Dio and getting that exposure too. So, yeah, their music kind of lends itself to be, it can go lots of different directions. But I think as they went on in their status as openers, by the time they got to Mindcrime and then opening for Metallica, that really was a much better fit in terms of like a darker lyrical kind of content. Of course, by that token, opening for Def Leppard before that might not have been the best match, but it did open them up to bigger audiences, which I think in the long run really helped them as they got to Empire. So,
yeah, I agree that Bon Jovi, Def Leppard, bands with very different tones. Now, I think there's probably still a good bit of fan crossover, but I also think that to an extent, and I'm not sure if this is accurate or not, but at least from my perspective, that Queensrÿche probably appeals more to a male audience than to a female audience, at least certainly at that time. So, they could have opened for Rush, would have been great. And, and all the Rush heads would have been sitting there, arms crossed, head bobbing. That would have been, and then they could open for Metallica, and, especially Metallica's angriest and probably most socially oriented albums, with and Justice for All. And that was a great match, tonally and style wise and all that. But, singing about pouring sugar over people or living on a prayer probably is not the kind of thing that segues as easily. And yet, I think there's also a lot of crossover fan appeal. So I think in some ways they really built an audience, although again, it does feel slightly awkward.
When you look back on it, in retrospect, it actually was really smart for them because they did build their audience that way. But the other thing too, that I think that, especially in 2024, folks that are maybe in their mid-20s, 30s, they might not have an appreciation for is back in the 80s and even in the early 90s, hard rock and rock was rock, and it was metal. Like, we called everything metal back in the late 80s. Like, if it had heavy guitars, it was metal. That's how it was pigeonholed, or it was rock. Like, nobody cared. So you would have like bands opening for bands that you wouldn't think would mesh with one another, just because it was all hard rock. It was all rock. These days, with all the different subgenres of metal and rock and trying to pigeonhole things, it might seem a little foreign to somebody who's used to that. But back in the day, it was really wide open, and I think that really helped Queensrÿche. Like I said, as they got into the Empire years, they had people coming from all over to see their show, and that was because they exposed themselves to their brand of music and their brand of rock to so many different types of audiences. It really helped them.
Yeah, it was. I'm totally with you on that. It was a smart move. Even if they weren't necessarily the perfect fit, they certainly had a lot of opportunity to build an audience that way. And definitely, I can recall back in the day, if you open up somebody's cassette case back when we had those things, or their little CD sleeve or whatever, you'd see all those bands we named, and they'd all pretty much be together. There might be some people that were so hardcore thrash that they wouldn't want anything to do with Def Leppard and Bon Jovi, but there were a lot of people perfectly happy to put all of it together.
Yeah, I mean, case in point, I'm the ideal example. I enjoy Bon Jovi's "Slippery and When Wet." I like Def Leppard, not quite pour some sugar on me, but I definitely like Pyromania. But then again, I like Metallica's "And Justice for All." I like heavier music. Meshuggah's something I really like, and Forbidden, Bay Area thrash. So it all kind of, you look at somebody's CD collection and music collection now. I mean, it can be pretty wide ranging. It's funny how things have just kind of boiled down to subgenre. And back in the day, there was none. It was just rock or metal.
There wasn't that much. It hadn't quite splintered to that degree. No. So I'm curious, in the course of putting all this together, of course, you pulled from a lot of different sources and all these bootlegs and things like that. And at the same time, you mixed in your own personal perspectives and your own personal experiences. What was it like sharing all those stories and having to pull those out? Was it a thing where you just took it from memory, or did you link up with old friends that experienced this stuff with you to talk about it together and see what other memories you could pull out of it by talking about it?
To be honest with you, it's a tribute to it. I really have to attribute it to all the fellow collectors of Queensrÿche's live shows that I've befriended over the years. When I started my website, and I was pulling from other people's work, and you get to know these people. My friend Johan Wall in Sweden, my friend Matt Kakuzo, who lives in Massachusetts. We're all big time collectors. We all have all these memories of all these shows that we collected, these shows that we saw. And it spans the world. I mean, I've got friends of mine that are in Belgium that wrote, my friend Raf, who wrote this huge, and you probably saw it, this huge essay about the murder that happened on Queensrÿche's Belgian show on the Empire tour. So it was just a matter of getting together again with old friends and talking about things and, asking them to write certain things. And for me, just my own personal stuff that went in there. It was just sitting down, rewatching the shows that I went to. I'm fortunate. The shows that I saw the original lineup of the band, I have those on video and I have those on CD as well. And I could just sit down and rewatch it and then go. And then it kind of, certain things would pop into my head. And I said, oh yeah, I remember this and this and this. And I could share something. But to be honest, the book, I said this earlier, this book is really about all of us fans. And you see a lot of these tour history books are written from the band's perspective or from the promoter's perspective. This is a fan-driven book. It's done at a professional level quality. I mean, I'm a writer for a living. That's what I do. I'm a writer and an editor. But this was meant specifically for all of us who stand out from the stage and watch everything. This is what this book was meant for. And it was a fun trip down memory lane with friends, basically put into book form with just an emphasis on accuracy. I know Queensrÿche had a little partnership with Ross Halfin a few months back where they released this big tour photo book that they did. And it was interesting because I announced my book right before Ross Halfin, who everybody should know is a famous rock photographer, announced his. And I was like, this is actually going to be perfect because Ross is going to have this from the band's perspective. And my book is going to be the same type of coffee table type book. It's going to be from the fan perspective. And when Ross's book came out, I'm like, yep, this is perfect. You want to look at the professional photos? You can go look in some of the band anecdotes. Go ahead. If you want to open up and read every detail about all of those gigs, you can open up my book and look through all that and get your professional photos as well, since we have a lot of pro and amateur photo sets throughout Roads to Madness as well. Yeah. And I hope that answered your question. I was trying to figure out a way to answer it correctly.
Yes, no, it absolutely did. I think to me too is reading the heartbreak, I think, of the one story you talked about where you had the backstage passes and everything just fell apart, basically. I had a friend at Tower Records, I think it was, if memory says. And
that was Brian Nairn. Yeah, that was Brian Nairn. You threw me there for a second. But yes, that was a I felt so bad from him. I mean, Brian Nairn and I have been friends since the early 2000s. And he's one of the biggest Queensrÿche memorabilia collectors in the world. He has this traveling museum, I call it, called the Reichian Archives, that he's displayed before big Queensrÿche shows in Seattle. And we did it a few years back when we did the Queensrÿche biography, Building an Empire. We got this hotel ballroom or conference room and put on this huge display. And Brian, it was a shame that story was where he got he had tickets to see Queensrÿche open for AC/DC, and then he thought he was going to be able to. He was just going to go, and somebody said, "Hey, I got backstage passes and better tickets." So he sold his, and then he ended up his friend bailed on him, and he wasn't able to get in until much, much later, and he missed most of the Queensrÿche set. That sucks, but he made up for it in the long run.
Expectations here, reality here.
Exactly.
And that's like, to me, that it's almost like a rags to riches story. You think you've got the world on a platter, and next thing you know, everything that could go wrong basically does. But yes, that is a heart-wrenching story. But I love those little inserts here and there where you've got these personal recountings of history or experience or whatever, and I think that really, again, it adds to that whole flavor of this is a book by fans for fans.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what it's for. And one of the nice things is that you can read it in multiple different ways. I mean, I tend to like to read things from cover to cover, but I've written these tour history essays so that if you want to read it cover to cover, as you go along, you can follow the band's path to success, and they're kind of dipped down during Promised Land and Here in the Now Frontier. You've got that arc, and you can read that. Right. But and I hope everybody does who checks out the book, because it's a fun trip down memory lane. But then you can also use it to just look up information. How many times did Queensrÿche play this song, or when was the first time they played this song? You could just flip through and find it. And that goes back to the point we were talking about earlier about it being interactive. We wanted to just find a way to make the book something that people will continually go back to. Right. A lot of the times with these coffee table books, it's something that literally sits on your coffee table, and for this, like, you could put it on your table in your den, your music room or whatever, and you might not open it up. Well, this book, if you're a big fan, you're going to want to continually go back to it. And I was really glad that Brian and I made that an emphasis on this book is, okay, let's make sure we can read it, but let's not make it like a biography where you just read it once and you shelve it. Let's make this that just people keep coming back to it. And I hope we accomplish that.
Yeah. A little bit like a reference guide at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when you look back over the course of creating this for yourself, what do you think was the most gratifying part of all of it? Like what was the thing that at the end of it you went, wow, I'm so glad I did this because I got to also do or got to experience whatever in the course of doing it?
It's a good question. I would say probably I'm really gratified that I was able to take all this information that I started putting together when I was a kid, 17, 16, and really made an emphasis on making sure that everything that I collected was accurate and then putting it together into something for somebody to enjoy. For me, it's about the book, and I've said this before about different things. As long as the book, in terms of success, paid for itself, I didn't care if I made a dime. I still don't. I mean, it's paid for itself. I didn't care if I made a dime as long as it covered its costs. My big thing was I wanted to preserve the original band's live history. The band hasn't done it. They probably won't do it, not in the way that this is done. And if they do, they'll probably use the material from my book, just because I'm the one who's collected this along with key other people. For years, as fans, we've collected all this and verified it. Nobody else has done that. And so I wanted to make sure that what was most gratifying was just to preserve that history, because the band that was Queensrÿche from 1981 to 1997, as an entity and what they were, is very different than what Queensrÿche is in 2024. And I'm not even talking about the music. I'm talking about just as an organization, as a business, as a group of guys that do things. They're so different. And this era of the band, which is where most people discovered Queensrÿche, was through the original lineup's music. A lot of that history over the years after DeGarmo left, in particular, some of that history got rewritten in not such an accurate way. And then it definitely took another dive once Tate left and Rockenfield left. So for me, the most gratifying thing is knowing that this history of this really great bunch of five guys with a great catalog of music is preserved accurately for everybody in the future who wants to know about them. That was the biggest thing for me, Dave. I'm such a big, passionate fan about that original band's music. I wanted to make sure anybody that would ever pick this thing up would go, I can count on this to be right. And it's right. I put the work in, and so did Brian Nairn, to make sure all of us fellow fans, when we picked up this book, we had as Brian Nairn likes to say, a piece of memorabilia, something that you can hold that is top notch. And that's what feels good about it, is preserving that history.
Yeah, very nice. I am curious, has there been any reaction you're aware of, any interaction with the Queensrÿche camp? Have any of them acknowledged the existence of this tome?
They have. I really would rather not talk about it. It was very positive.
That's good.
Yes, at least one member of the original band reached out and said that he was very, very happy with what was done and was very thankful that somebody took the time to do it so accurately. And that made it all worth it to me.
Yeah, that's got to be almost the ultimate praise out of all of it, although it wasn't written for them. It was written for the fans. So if the book is also successful, that means what more could you ask for, right?
No, you really can't. And I'll be honest, like once we the audience may not know this, but I was a co-writer of the first biography on Queensrÿche, which was called Building an Empire. Yeah. And James Beach is the one who was the main author of that one, and Brian Nairn and myself contributed. And during that process, I have known Eddie Jackson for years, and so during that process, I put together the book with the other authors, and we met with them and gave them copies of the biography. And Eddie was like, well, "Why didn't you tell me you were doing this sort of thing?" He goes, "I had a whole bunch of stuff I could have contributed." So I said, "Next time I do a book, we'll be in touch." So for Roads to Madness, I called him and said, "Here's what we're doing," and he loved the idea. And Eddie was just like, "But I can clarify some things," because I had a couple questions of things I wasn't sure about, and who better than the horse's mouth to get the answers. And he clarified a few details for me, but when it came down to like contributing things, he said, he goes, "I've got a few things," he goes, "but I want to hold on to it just in case we do our own book. We do something," and I hope they do. That'd be really cool to see. So I appreciated the fact that he helped clarify a few details for me, but but yeah, it was. I apologize, I'm getting lost, Dave, but it was cool to have the recognition, and it was really cool that it's that the book was well received.
Yeah, excellent. Well, from what I've read too, yeah, absolutely, it is a very, very nicely detailed. Very well presented, and it's really cool to read all that. Like, to me, this is kind of the first time going through a book of this nature, and to see all that, and it's kind of definitely a different kind of perspective than the usual band biography. So I think you nailed it on the head with what your goal was. I think you absolutely did exactly what you wanted, and you nailed it.
Well, I really appreciate that. The two books that really influenced where Roads to Madness went stylistically were Russia's Wandering the Face of the Earth. That's a similar book. It's a tour history kind of book that came out several years ago now. I want to say it came out 7-8 years ago. Wonderful book. If you haven't checked it out, check it out. The other one was a book called The Making of Appetite for Destruction, by why can't I remember, Mark Cantor, who was Slash's best friend, and he recounted the band's history from before they got signed and all their old gigs, and took photos. And he put this book out maybe 15 years ago, and it has all these little anecdotes. So if you take those two books and you put them together, that's kind of the outline of, this is how I want to really present Queensrÿche in the Roads to Madness book. But those were the two books that really kind of influenced the direction.
Wonderful. Brian, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. This has been very enlightening. I love hearing the perspective of the person behind a book. I so seldom get to do that. It's only the second time I've interviewed an author, but it's immensely cool to hear what propelled you forward and get the little tidbits. But the book's a fascinating read. It's absolutely something I would recommend. So hopefully we can help you sell some more books.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. This has been fun. And, I'm just, for the folks that check it out, that are listening, if you elect to check it out, I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun to do. And it's just, it's nice to preserve the history of a band that has such a rich background and music that everybody from pop metal to progressive metal people just still love to this day. And it's nice to put together something that hopefully will be appreciated, for years to come.
Yeah, I have no doubt that was a very special period for the band. So I know there will always be a demand for it. So good luck with the rest of it, and thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate your time. It's been very nice chatting and meeting.
Thanks, Dave. Same here.
So did I tell you that was a cool story or not? It's pretty amazing to me, the passion and the detail oriented approach to pulling all of this together. I think it's beyond me and my ADHD brain. I don't think I could ever dedicate myself and pull together all of this information like this. So kudos to you, Brian, man. Really awesome job you've done with this book, and just an amazing endeavor on top of even writing the autobiography of Queensrÿche. Dude, you are truly a Queensrÿche fan to be admired, and really a rock fan to be admired. Just great stuff there, man. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time, and I hope the book is selling really well for you. And I hope we can do our little part here at Bleeding Edge to push it a little bit more up into that sales realm. Let's make this critter a huge hit as much as we can. I think you've got that done on your own. You don't need help from me, but I'll do what I can to spread the word, of course. Thank you once again. Wishing you all the success, man. And for those of you that are tuning in, listening, watching, whatever you're doing, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me. If you could drop a like and a subscribe and whatever you need to do, that would be wonderful. If you want to take a few moments and peruse the social media links in the description, you can follow along on Twitter. And yeah, I'm still calling it Twitter. Screw you, Elon Musk. And Instagram and Facebook and all that stuff. You can see what goes on there. Been a little slow lately, I'll admit, but I'm going to get back on the horse with that. And also, don't forget to check out The Expanse, my live 365 channel out there for all those prog lovers. Nothing but progressive rock and metal all day long. And on Sundays, we dedicate it to 60s and 70s roots progressive rock. It's called the Brain Salad Sunday. I think you'll dig it. Meanwhile, that's all I got for you right now. Thank you so much again for joining me. Remember, always reminding you, never fear to deviate from the norm. Keep it proggy. And this is Super Dave, signing off.